And Audacity in 3, 2, 1.
Hi, guys, and welcome back to the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co-host, Marissa Roy. And in today's episode, we have a very special guest back with us for the second time, Gabrielle Fundaro. We previously had her on for episode 22, where we discussed body image, behavior change, and the health at every size movement. But today we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're extremely excited to chat with her today all about gut health. So we recommend listening to the episode to get the full rundown on who she is and her incredible background. But just in case someone is listening to the podcast for the very first time, can you give us, and I don't know if this is possible, probably not because you have such an array of accomplishments and hobbies, but a quick rundown on your background and what got you to where you are today and with gut health specifically.
Sure. So I am Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro, known around the internet as Vitamin PhD. I got my bachelor's in exercise science and then went straight to my PhD in human nutrition, foods, and exercise at Virginia Tech. I originally had intended to study the effects of high-fat feeding on muscle hypertrophy, but as a result of human error, as is quite common in the scientific process, we lost the essential samples for that project. And so my side project on probiotic supplementation became my main gig and the focus of my dissertation. And I finished that up after 5 years of research and a teaching fellowship in 2014. And I went on to teach in exercise science. And I was in my 4th year of teaching when Mike Israetel of Renaissance Periodization found me in an ISSN Facebook group and liked the content that I was putting out on my tiny little blog and my tiny little IG page. And he and Nick recruited me to the Renaissance Periodization team. So I was an RP coach for about 5 years. And during that period of time, I started my own telehealth business, Vitamin PhD Nutrition, and authored a series of articles and developed an iterative sort of coaching framework with my colleague, Shannon Beer. I started to talk about gut health when I resigned from academia. So that was a year into my coaching gig with RP, and 6 months into owning my own business, I realized that I probably couldn't do all 3 of those things well at the same time. And I was just finding coaching to be so fulfilling and engaging that I thought I'd give it a try, being an entrepreneur. And Mike had the incredible foresight at the time, because this was back in 2017, for me to start talking about gut health and to be sort of the RP and internet evidence-based voice of that part of the industry, because there was so much misinformation circulating at that time. So one of my first podcasts was Steve Hall, Revive Stronger, in 2017. And I was super, super nervous, and it went okay. And from there, it was sort of a snowball effect that, the next month I got another invitation for a podcast. And then next month I got 2, and then 3 and 4. And for a while I was up to doing 5 to 7 a week. I can't do that anymore. I realized, I can spread these out a little bit. And so I've tried to do that. And I have now gone on to just running my business full time and running the comprehensive coaching side of things. I'm now a writer for examine.com, and I'm starting in on another upcoming project in probably like the next couple of years, creating some more educational content on gut health. So that's how I got here. It was sort of a series of serendipitous accidents and being in the right place at the right time, and having a really generous group of people who invite me to speak about this stuff.
Wow, that's awesome. So I guess, where do we even start with this? I mean, we have so many questions that we want to ask you about this today, and I think we're going to cover a lot, but I think the biggest thing here is to preface, like, what is gut health, because I think a lot of times we talk about it when we talk about, oh, I took this green supplements and it healed my gut, or oh, probiotics are good for your gut, or my digestion is off, my gut is off, or something like that. And I don't feel like most people really know what they're talking about when they say stuff like that. I mean, I probably like butcher it as well, because like I just don't really know what we're really talking about here. And I've listened to a couple of your podcast interviews on this topic specifically, and I feel like I learned so much, and I'm just so excited to share this with everyone. So from me personally, thank you for being on as well. And walk us through what is gut health.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I'm always glad to be able to speak to a new audience and kind of quell the misinformation and make sure that they're making informed choices. Now, for a long time, I've said that I haven't seen the term gut health in literature, in actually looking at what's coming out of the scientific community. And I can no longer say that, because I actually came upon a study that talked about, I believe it was a low FODMAP intervention, improving gut health. And I thought, wow, I guess that term has finally made it into the academia sphere. So that being said, it is not a term that has one clear definition. And so it can be used to mean a lot of different things, depending on, kind of what we're trying to market. And it's used colloquially probably to refer to three main aspects. And so I've called these the 3 Bs of gut health. So when people are talking about gut health, or when they're using that term, they're probably referring to diversity. So talking about the diversity of the gut microbiome, disease, so that we have the presence or absence of an organic or functional disease of the GI tract, and then digestion. So how comfortably they feel like they're digesting and assimilating the foods that they're eating. And when marketers are using that term, they're quite often also using terms like bad gut health or good gut health, as though we can sort of, in an umbrella way, assess whether all of those things are functioning properly or not, and that we can determine that based on how we're feeling, which really isn't the case. So when we're looking at that first B of diversity, we are evaluating both the richness, so the number of organisms that are in the GI tract, and also the evenness or the proportions of organisms. So ideally, we have more organisms that are either beneficial or neutral than we have organisms that could potentially cause disease. But we would never expect to see 0 organisms that could potentially cause disease. There aren't really bad microbes. It's like there aren't bad dogs. There are microbes that are put into a specific context in which they might cause disease. And there are dogs that, when put into a specific environment, may have behavioral issues. So context really matters. And we find that there's probably a kind of a Goldilocks curve to diversity. So if we have too little, that means that we may have an overabundance or an overgrowth of some microbes that could cause disease, or we may lack the genetic functionality and the diversity of genes. So that means that our microbiome can't do as much. And we really do need it to perform a number of different tasks for us, anything from immune defense to assimilating nutrients from our diet. And the other thing that we're looking at with diversity would be if we have too great diversity, too much diversity, I lost my train of thought there for a second, that we might not have the amount of redundancy that's helpful to us. So we don't have enough microbes that can do the same thing, to say, oh, this group got knocked out, that's all right, this one can step in. And so there's a theory that could actually reduce the stability. So it's not always like more is better. We need to have like the right amount, but the right amount really hasn't been characterized yet. It's like the right amount for you specifically at this point in time. So diversity is associated with a couple different things. One being cardiovascular fitness. So people who are aerobically fit tend to have greater microbial diversity, especially in numbers of bacteria that we think are probably pretty beneficial. And then also the intake of a diverse number of plants in the diet. So if you don't have to be vegetarian or vegan, but if you're eating a diverse array of what we call microbe accessible carbohydrates, so things that are indigestible to humans and go into the large intestine, they can be used as energy for the microbes there. So those support diversity. When we're looking at disease, that's a little bit more obvious. Does the person have functional disease like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome? Tissues are normal, but the function is not. Or do they have something like an inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's or colitis, where both the tissues and the function are affected by a disease? Now, we don't have a cause-effect relationship between the microbiome and any disease, so we don't know whether certain microbes might cause certain illnesses, but we're starting to see some characteristics of different disease states. So it just so happens that folks with IBS tend to have a sort of a characteristic snapshot of a microbiome. So they tend to have a greater number of certain pathogens than people who don't have that disease. But again, we don't know that they actually are causing that disease. And then we're looking at digestion. So does a person feel like they're able to tolerate the amount of gas that their microbes are producing? Are they having comfortable bowel movements 3 times a day to 3 times a week? Rating that on the Bristol stool scale as a 3-ish, so pretty firm, comes out in 1 comfortable movement, and you feel like you're done. Or are they having some issues where they're feeling constipated or experiencing diarrhea, or the stool looks unusual in some way? And if something abnormal is going on, it's really a great idea to go to a gastroenterologist first, rather than kind of like trying to find out what supplements might help. So those are usually what people, I think, are talking about when they're talking about gut health. But quite often, I think they're trying to use how they're feeling as sort of a proxy for everything else that might be going on, or even trying to establish a cause-effect relationship between the microbiome and a disease state and how they're feeling. That really doesn't exist yet.
And I think the other interesting thing, and I can't remember if you talked about it on the previous episode, but I know that you've talked about this before, but when we talk about good and bad gut health, that can also vary by location. So an individual in another location might have quote unquote good gut health, but might look different from someone, say, here in the US.
Yeah, exactly. So when we are trying to characterize someone's microbiome as potentially health associated or disease associated, how do we tell, how can we tell who's supposed to be there anyway? How do we we have to have some reference, right, of what's healthy? That's usually what we're looking for, control or healthy population or something for any intervention. And the issue with doing that with the microbiome is that healthy individuals look different based on their location. So a person in Korea versus a person in the US versus a person in South Africa, they all could be considered healthy. There's an absence of any sort of disease or digestive issues, but they will be unique. They'll look very different. So we don't have one picture of health. We don't have, just like health can look different physically and in terms of functionality in our whole bodies. It's the same thing in the microbiome. And there's even a theory that within a diseased state, even though we call that dysbiosis, so it's that refers to any change or difference in one person's microbiome versus a healthy control. Dysbiosis isn't necessarily bad. It's not synonymous with disease. It's just different. And it could be that that's that person's healthiest or best or most functional possible microbiome, given that they have whatever disease they have. So we look at this as a whole ecosystem. It's made up of organisms that are competing for nutrients, competing for real estate. They are actually interacting with one another. They may kill off competing microbes. So we may have 2 microbes that want to occupy the same niche. One is probably going to dominate over the other. Or we might have some microbes that have a symbiotic relationship. So the waste product of one feeds the other. So it's not as simple as saying that we just have, this person is sick, so they must have an unhealthy gut. they must have bad gut health. Not necessarily. That's not one thing. It's a whole group of organisms trying to adapt to the challenges of their environment. And one of those challenges might be the presence of a GI disease.
Right. I think that makes me think of an analogy that my ex-phys teacher in undergrad actually gave us. And this is kind of in the context of we're in the fitness industry and we talk about, oh, like rev up your metabolism, or your metabolism is broken, or your metabolism is just slow. And I've always found that conversation very frustrating, because ever since I got an ex-phys textbook and opened up a like graphic representation of the metabolism, and I'm using air quotes, it's literally like a bazillion different pathways all overlapping and crossing each other like 1,000 times, and it spans across the entire like textbook page. And so I was like, that's a metabolism. It's working. Like, it's just really intricate. And so you made me think of that kind of with the gut microbiome, because it's like all of these different moving pieces that all work together. And just because you have some symptom or some thing happening with your body, or with, you know, with metabolism, with weight loss or weight gain, or with your gut microbiome with digestion, doesn't necessarily mean that you have a disease or don't have a disease, or the lack or presence of a symptom may or may not mean something. So it's really interesting kind of drawing that parallel as you were talking through that.
Yeah, that is exactly right. That's a really excellent parallel. And I think people will be more familiar with that picture of, you know, the totality of human metabolism, that it's the same thing when we're looking at microbes. You know, within one microbe, you know, the metabolic pathways might be a little simpler, but we're looking at the microbiome. Now, that is an entire ecosystem. We're talking tens of trillions of microorganisms and millions of genes to be expressed. It's incredibly complex. So even if we do, you know, have a randomized control trial with one intervention, so we want to look at the effects of fiber or specific probiotic or a low FODMAP diet on the microbiome itself. Like, let's not even, we don't even care about symptoms. We don't even care about its clinical relevance. Let's just look at how it influences the microbiome. We could take one type of fiber. We can just like, let's give people inulin. That's a FODMAP. Let's see how that affects their microbiome. We can't even really assume that the changes that we're seeing in the relative abundance of microbes are directly a result of just the inulin. Because what could be happening is that the inulin is influencing some microbe that we haven't yet been able to identify, that's not showing up in our analysis. And it's producing some postbiotic that is influencing the microbes that we are actually analyzing. And we also have other variables that we can't control for, like genetics. So our very own genes, not to a great extent, but our genes influence our microbiome. So, you know, even when we're trying to do something as simple as like, you know, what is a fiber going to do? It's not that simple. So to say, oh, I took my greens powders, or I took this probiotic, or, you know, I took this antimicrobial, you know, supplement, and that got rid of all the bad pathogens, you know, all the bad bugs in my gut. No, it didn't. And like, we wish it was that simple.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the next question that I wanted to ask was, what does the gut influence? And I think you really covered that. I mean, with the 3 Ds of gut health, and just how vast that is. Like, it literally touches every part of our body. Now, one kind of, I guess, extension off of that is we hear a lot about this brain gut connection. And I am so curious to know, you know, because it wasn't directly one of the Ds of gut health. So how much of that is pseudoscience, or is there a connection between our brain and our gut that we should be aware of?
Yeah, it's definitely not pseudoscience, but it is a very new area. So what we're seeing is really like we're in the infancy stages, if you could even say that, because most of what we've seen have been preclinical trials. That means stuff in rodents. And although rodent data can be really useful in terms of establishing mechanisms or maybe even proof of concept, they're not intended to be extrapolated to humans. So when we do like a fecal transplant into a rodent, that can be sort of confirmatory. We can say, all right, well, we saw this in humans, Do we also see it in rodents? Okay, we see it there, and we can also take out their tissues and establish real mechanisms. That's super useful. And we can also rear mice to be germ-free, so they're completely sterile, and then we fill them with only the microbes of interest. That's super cool. Definitely not something that we can do in humans. And then even some of the tests that we use as sort of a proxy for depression or social behavior in rodents. I would pose the question, like, do mice have moods? Can we say that, like, if you take a rat and you fill it with like a specific microbiome, does it have a sense of like ennui after that? Does it like really feel a longing for like greater meaning in its life? Or is it like chasing cheese through a maze because it can smell it? So even the researchers in that field would say, like, this is not meant to be an exact representation of what the human experience would be. And quite often, the fecal microbiome transplant studies that we use in mice, when we try to translate that to humans, we just don't see the same robustness, the same magnitude of effect that we see in rodents. So when we're looking at things like, a specific probiotic did this in mice, or, we sever the vagus nerve in mice, that's not really going to translate to humans. And similarly, when we look at human trials and say we have, one area that's been really popular has been fecal transplant in children with autism. The initial trials didn't have a placebo control. So that means that, yes, there was a change over time, but unless we have a group that didn't get a fecal transplant, we have no way of knowing whether it was time that caused the change or it was the actual fecal transplant. And because of those limitations, we aren't at a point yet where we can say, like, yes, we've really established a cause-effect relationship between specific microbes or the microbiome as a whole and autism or depression or anxiety. Now, we do have some interesting correlations between IBS and anxiety or depression. So people with a mood disorder are quite likely also going to have an IBS diagnosis. So about 50% of folks with IBS also have a mood disorder and vice versa. So that's a pretty strong relationship. But, we also have to consider the fact that, IBS comes with reduction in quality of life, and so there's a relationship there that maybe not necessarily explained by just the microbiome itself, but by the effects of IBS on like our quality of life, and then how it might affect our social connections and how that could in turn influence, the prevalence of a mood disorder. So again, it's a more complex system than just saying like, okay, put in a bad gut microbiome and out comes a mood disorder or outcomes, whatever outcome. That being said, there is the brain gut connection is an anatomical one. So we have the vagus nerve, which puts out about 75% of our parasympathetic nervous system tone. So that really runs the rest and digest process. So that directly connects the brain to the gastrointestinal tract. And the microbiota, so the microorganisms within the gut, can produce various neurotransmitters or precursors to certain neurotransmitters, most of which are not going to cross the blood-brain barrier, but they still could influence the portions of the brain that are not covered by the blood-brain barrier, and there could also potentially be some peripheral communication. So there's a bidirectional type of communication, so the brain to the gut and vice versa. And the gut actually also has its own independent nervous system. The enteric nervous system kind of runs on its own, separate from the central nervous system. And that kind of is like the all hands on deck, like the up and like the up close nervous system that really regulates the day-to-day operations and like minute-to-minute operations of the GI tract. So our GI tract isn't stationary unless we're eating. It actually goes through a process of these systematic wave-like contractions that kind of like move food along every several hours. You think of it kind of like doing a clean sweep, making room for the next meal. And fortunately, our brain doesn't have to expend excess energy in regulating that because of the enteric nervous system. And there's a great deal that we really don't know, because we've seen some really interesting stuff in rodents in terms of the influence of the microbiome on just brain development. So rearing mice without any microbes in their intestinal tract, they don't develop normally. So that's in terms of behavior, immunity, weight gain, brain function. But again, we can't really do that with humans. There's no way to have a human that's born completely sterile and keep them that way. So it's very likely that the microbiome plays a role in human development, but we just don't exactly know what that role is yet.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredibly interesting. And I really like the points on, do we establish causation between the brain and the gut, or, are these things kind of happening side by side, or as one thing changes, then we have all of these other things that change with it. And then how does that affect, and I think that goes for a lot of the stuff that Christina and I do with coaching. It's like, okay, well, your training's been suffering, but, let's look at sleep and diet and stress management and all of these other things that kind of like they can compile in one direction or the other, or they can kind of work separately, but at the end of the day, they always influence each other. So it's really interesting how much that applies to this as well. So I guess to kind of steer us in the direction of application. So our listeners are probably super interested by this, but a lot of it, I think, is beyond the scope of maybe what they need to know in terms of how do I feel and what does this mean for me? And so I guess the first thing that I wanted to ask was, what are some common gut issues? I know you mentioned IBS already, but issues that's most likely, and I'm trying to word this as best I can or as accurately as I can from what you've given us, most likely stem from the gut microbiome that people have or develop, and what are symptoms of those diseases?
Well, I can't say that anything stems from the microbiome at this point because we haven't established that.
Right.
Yeah, and actually, even in there's a review on risk factors of intestinal permeability. That's kind of like, people call that leaky gut. And intestinal permeability wasn't associated with any specific characteristic microbiome. So there wasn't any profile that really seemed to stand out. And by and large, we really don't have like outward symptoms, if you want to call it that, of anything with like outside the realms of extreme pathogen infection. If you have C. diff, if you have listeria, if you have salmonella, so you've like picked up a foodborne illness, those I could say would be microbiome related.
Right.
And you will know that you have one of these infections because you will have severe watery diarrhea. You'll be in the hospital. So if you have one of those infections, then yes, that's pathogen associated. Like, they are potential pathogens. They've entered your GI tract. They're producing their virulence factors. They're producing toxins that make you sick, and you get sick. That being said, you could have C. diff in your gut and not get sick. You have staph in your gut and you're not sick. You have strep in your gut and you're not sick, even E. coli, because it's the effects are strain specific. So there are species of E. coli that are actually beneficial, and they're not going to cause you any issues. And they also have to be, again, in the context of the ability to make you sick. So they have to be there in high enough abundance to produce these virulent factors and actually cause illness. Many of them are just existing in your gut, just doing nothing, existing, just doing their thing. So if we have something like, a comprehensive stool analysis or whatnot, where they say, oh, you've got some staph in your gut, you've got some strep and whatnot, and they're like, this level is way too high. Well, they've actually established those reference ranges on their own. Like, there's not one reference range that we've been able to establish to say, like, okay, this much of this specific strain of this species, this causes everyone to get sick. So just keeping that in mind, the most common complaints that people would have outside of some sort of infectious illness, it's usually something to do with bloating, gas, constipation, or diarrhea. So those can be just acute, They could be associated with IBS. I always encourage folks to go to their doctor if they notice that things seem to be really out of whack for a fairly long period of time. You can get screened, you'll get a colonoscopy and things like that, so they can rule out potential illness. The rates of colon cancer are increasing in younger and younger people. So people below the age of 40 are being diagnosed with colon cancer. So it's a good idea to just go get checked out if things are unusual. And I say that because right now it seems really popular to like not do that and instead to like take a probiotic or do a cleanse or something. It's like, just check the boxes off first on get the big rocks out of the way kind of thing. So ruling out, the presence of a disease, or even if you do find that you have IBS, that can still be managed through diet. And that's really the case when it comes to constipation and diarrhea and bloating. Your microbes are metabolizing the indigestible carbohydrates, the carbohydrates that are indigestible to you. And as a result, they are producing a combination of short chain fatty acids and gases. And you have to pass the gas. So it comes out as flatulence, or it might sort of feel trapped in there. You feel like, you're not passing it comfortably. There's just a lot of bloating. So that can come down to just kind of like modifying the ratio of fermentable to less fermentable carbohydrates in your diet, and other lifestyle interventions as well. But that's kind of like the big rock for that one. When it comes to something like constipation, sometimes constipation comes along with people who are chronically dieting. So GI motility can actually be reduced with chronic low energy intake. Your body is trying to efficiently absorb all of the potential nutrients in whatever little bit you might be eating. So constipation can occur with that. Folks are also are often also eating high amounts of high volume foods. So they're very fibrous. Maybe they're not taking in adequate water, so they have a bunch of fiber, not enough water. Fiber is another one of those things that has sort of a Goldilocks effect. So too little or too much can cause GI distress, constipation, gas, bloating. And then, folks might also be using a lot of sugar alcohol. So a lot of kind of protein bars and shakes and things like that people might be using in an attempt to lose weight. Those contain sugar alcohols, which are fermentable with the exception of erythritol, and also can have a laxative effect. So it's not uncommon for folks to feel really crummy if they've, had a recent diet change and they're like, I've been trying to eat healthier. I've been increasing my fiber, or, I'm trying to, do more protein shakes and things like that. And then like, oh my gosh, the gas is so bad. It smells awful. I'm so bloated all the time. And it comes down to something like, they're reacting to the FODMAPs in avocados or apples, or they're taking in a lot of sugar alcohols. And then they're being sold this idea that, they have bad gut health and they need a probiotic or to do some sort of cleanse or reset, or, that's why they're having a difficult time losing weight. And that's really not the case. It's just a very normal result of eating these foods that have chemical properties that attract water. They're highly fermentable, and your microbes do what microbes do. They're like, hey, thanks. This is great. This is a good meal. And they're producing gas.
And I love the point that you made about how a lot of people, and it's kind of our society nowadays where it's like, oh, you have a symptom. So it's like, oh, well, let me just take this supplement that's supposed to help with this symptom, rather than trying to figure out, well, is there something deeper? Like, what's the root cause? Why am I bloating? Why am I constipated? Why is this happening? Rather than, oh, we'll just slap a Band-Aid on it and keep going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And spending a lot of time even or money, on interventions that probably aren't that effective either. And it's really unfortunate that, we're kind of being, even if there's nothing wrong, it's like this idea that, something's probably wrong. You just don't know it yet.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you touched on a couple of things that I really do want to get into that I think are the hot topics in this area of the industry right now. And that is fibers and sugar alcohols, artificial sweeteners. And you mentioned, so I just want to get some definitions out of the way for anyone who might not be following quite as closely. So you mentioned fibers that are indigestible or insoluble to humans, things that are fermentable. Could you just quickly define, insoluble versus soluble fiber, as well as what being fermentable means as a carbohydrate?
Yeah. So in most cases, fermentable fibers are also going to be soluble. That means that they attract water. So a soluble fiber example would be something like oatmeal. If you put it into water and you left it there for a little while, it would soak up the water, it become really soft and sort of viscous. So another way that we term those fibers would be that they are viscous. And bacteria can ferment those to produce energy for themselves. So they can produce ATP through that process. And then they produce some waste products, gases, and then short chain fatty acids, which we actually consider to be postbiotic beneficial compounds. So in doing that, they take something that is indigestible to us. We don't have the digestive enzymes to break those carbohydrates down, and they convert them to something that is actually absorbable for us, the short chain fatty acids. So they can actually increase the amount of energy that we can harvest from our diet, not to a huge extent, but the estimates so far are that it could account for an increase of up to about 200 calories or 10% of our energy intake. So it's something to keep in mind, that if your calculations seem to be not working out in the way that you would expect in terms of energy balance and weight change, maybe you have a really adept group of microbes that are harvesting energy for you, and you might need to adjust your intake. So just something to consider. It's not something that would completely stall your weight loss efforts. It's something to just include in your calculation. No, I just forgot. Okay, sorry, I just forgot the question for a second. My day started really early today. So
all good.
You guys can edit that part out. Now, when we're talking about a non-fermentable or a poorly fermentable fiber, that's usually going to be insoluble as well. So it's something like an apple peel. If you were to put that into a cup of water and you come back 30 minutes later, it's going to look no different at all. So it's not attracting water, and it's not as readily fermentable. So those microbes can't break down those carbohydrates as easily and use them for energy. So whereas the soluble fibers can be really helpful to sort of bind excess cholesterol and also be used as an energy source for the microbe, the insoluble fibers are really helpful for creating bulk in the stool and potentially even sort of enhancing the production of the protective mucus layer in your gut. So they work together to form comfortable stool that will pass easily and also have benefits to cardiovascular health. That being said, if we have a lot of fermentable fiber in our diet and our microbes are producing a lot of gas, we might feel uncomfortable. Or if we're having a lot of those, the fibers or the carbohydrates that like to attract water, so some of those FODMAPs, then that could have a laxative effect. So we could be eating a diet that's really high in fiber and very nutrient dense and still feel crummy afterwards. So it's just something to keep in mind that if we're feeling that way, it doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong.
Right. Right. And when it comes to fiber intake, we try to give recommendations to our listeners and to our clients of, well, okay, how much fiber should we generally be eating on average? Because obviously there's going to be the person who has a very distinct microbiome who maybe can't have that much fiber and feel good. There might be people, and I've seen people, clients specifically like long-term vegans can tolerate very, very high fiber intakes because of how many plant-based like fruits, vegetables, and things that they're eating regularly. So I've seen things across the spectrum, but in general, my typical recommendation for someone who's starting out, we don't really have any symptoms or issues going on, is around like 20 to the upper end, like 40 grams of fiber per day. Would you agree with that? Would you add anything to that or change anything about that recommendation?
No, I mean, the recommendations for men and women vary a little bit. Women aim for about 25 grams per day, and men, the recommendation is 38 grams per day, or you could calculate about 15 grams per 1,000 calories ingested. In the US, the average intake is about 15 to 19 grams per day. So if you're taking in more than that, you're already ahead of the game. And the other key is that you're attaining that from a variety of different sources. So we really don't know which microbes prefer which type of indigestible carbohydrate. So the recommendation is just to give them a bunch, sort of like a fish tank, that like they might have different needs and wants. And so you provide a variety of different fish flakes. Otherwise, you might find that one school, eats another school because they don't have adequate energy availability.
Right. Yeah. Because I know personally, I feel best when I get most of my fiber from real food sources, fruits, vegetables, whole grains. And I've had clients who they're like, oh, you want me to get this much fiber? All right, fiber 1 bars, protein bars, fiber supplement. And I'm like, do you feel okay? And they're like, yeah, everything is dandy. And I'm like, all right, then, I'm not going to try to touch that then, as long as you feel okay. And then other clients might really struggle to get in fiber, try those things and feel like crap. And it's really interesting to see just the variability with that and what is too much for some people and what is normal for others. And in the past, before I kind of knew a little bit, like still don't really know much. Do any of us really know much about the gut? But like before I knew a little bit about fiber and that sort of thing, I had a vegan client and I remember this distinctly. And she mentioned having some digestive issues. And I looked at her fiber and I was like, okay, well, we're getting like, 50, 60 grams of fiber in per day. Like that's a lot. Maybe we can bring that down. And we gave it a shot. It was really hard because she was vegan and it didn't change anything. And I was like, but it was supposed to be like A to B, like this should work. And like it's just so interesting to like think about that in hindsight with all of this knowledge now. That's not necessarily a cause effect.
Right, exactly. And it really comes down to also sort of the ratio and an individual's tolerance of the fermentable carbohydrates. So when we talk about FODMAP, it's fermentable oligodimonosaccharides and polyols. And so these are found in a variety of whole foods. So the ones that we see, and also in some processed foods as well. So you mentioned things like, fiber 1 bars and drinks and whatnot. Quite often, manufacturers are using inulin or chicory root, which is a form of inulin, which is a highly fermentable carbohydrate, to increase the fiber content of their product. And the issue is that because it's so fermentable and it's so osmotically active, that it can actually cause really severe GI distress. So like the microbes are super happy about it, but you might be getting gas pains and a lot of bloating and flatulence and diarrhea. So your point about getting fibers from whole foods is a great one, because that's sort of a layer of assurance that you won't be getting 15 grams of just one type of highly fermentable fiber in your diet that at one time that can really cause some GI distress. But some folks are very sensitive to FODMAPs, and it could be that they can really only tolerate a small amount of like avocado or asparagus or something, and another person can eat half of an avocado and feel just fine.
Right. So is chicory root and inulin what's in Quest bars? Because I've had accounts of that multiple times from myself and from clients.
Yeah, I think so. I think Quest bars, I know their formulation has changed over the years, and I want to say now, I think they are using maybe either allulose or erythritol, and those are actually not readily fermentable. And I think maybe soluble corn fiber. So as a soluble fiber, it would be, theoretically readily fermentable. But yeah, I actually haven't eaten a Quest bar in like a super, super long time, but I do keep an eye out for inulin and chicory root, because I know that those hit me hard. Like I've gotten, I had a little bit of oat milk one time, like a couple years ago. And I was at a little cafe, and like my friend went up to the counter and I was like, oh, can you get me like soy milk? And she was like, yeah, sure. And she came back and I'm drinking the coffee, and I was about halfway through the cup and I was like, oh man, I don't feel great, And I finished the cup of coffee and I'm like, oh, I've got abdominal pain. And I was like, what kind of soy milk did they put in there? And she was like, oh, they didn't have soy milk, they used oat milk. And I was like, no, but because not all brands have it, but some have the added, for mouthfeel, kind of give things like a creamy sort of viscous mouthfeel. And yeah, it was rough. So, it's not going to affect everyone in the same way, but that's really the most commonly, I call it kind of like, it's an aggressive FODMAP. So it's in onions and garlic. So if people are doing sort of a version of FODMAP light, where it's not such an intensive process, usually those are a couple that are briefly eliminated. You can see how you feel and then bring them back in because they're really concentrated sources of inulin.
Interesting. Yeah, I had to know because I was like, every time, like, I remember it was probably like circa 2014, 2015 when everyone was really into Quest bars. I was really into Quest bars. And I remember like I could tolerate one at a time, but there was, the day here and there where like I was just on the go and I was just grabbing them and grabbing them. By the end of the day, my stomach's like out, like past my toes. And I'm like, what is going on? And then I just like didn't go to the bathroom for 3 days. And I was like, what is this? So yeah, I have noticed that I get a lot. I'm not having like any issues like that when I do have them like from the gas station here and there when I'm on the go. So I do think that the formulation has changed, but that's like an account that I heard so many times that I think is really funny.
Yep.
2 a day. Oh,
I know. So on that note, I think we want to talk about artificial sweeteners and sugar alcohols, because you did mention for some people having a lot of those can cause some symptoms or some issues. And I think there's a lot around sugar alcohols because they are in a lot of supplements, like dietary supplements, and they're in a lot of just food products that we eat, sugar-free stuff that we get because we're like, ooh, the macros on this are great, it's sugar-free. And I'm very much a culprit of it. And thankfully, I haven't had any adverse reactions from sugar alcohols, but there is that question. And I feel like it's just a constant war on social media going on around this topic. So could you shed some light on this? I don't really know where to start, but sugar alcohols, maybe a definition and really giving us, debriefing the misconceptions that are out there.
Yeah. So sugar alcohols would be considered a FODMAP. They're part of the polyol group, and they actually do occur naturally. So sorbitol and mannitol are examples that we see in the group of FODMAPs. And sorbitol specifically is used in quite a few diet products like diet chocolate, like sugar-free chocolates, sugar-free syrups. So you'll see sorbitol as an ingredient, but it also occurs naturally in a lot of pit fruits, so things like peaches. So it is one that has a laxative effect universally. So all humans who eat sorbitol, if you eat enough of it, it'll have a laxative effect. And some people might be more sensitive than others. Now, as I mentioned, erythritol is a sugar alcohol that's actually not fermentable, but the rest would be considered either fermentable and or osmotically active, meaning they attract water. So if you eat a large bolus of sugar alcohol, it hits your gut, it's going to pull a lot of water in. That's going to cause a lot of stretching or distension. And in people who have IBS, they have some visceral hypersensitivity that could be perceived as really painful for them. And then it also could induce that laxative effect. So you would have like some pretty severe diarrhea. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is like harming your microbiome or harming your gut. Obviously, if you do this chronically and you have chronic diarrhea, that could certainly be harmful to health in general. But, if it's something that happens to you every once in a while, like you have a protein bar or something, and or, a whole bag of sugar-free gummy bears or something, because you lost a bet. It's just an effect of the chemical properties of the foods that you're eating. Now, sugar alcohols are different from artificial sweeteners. Our artificial sweeteners are a form of non-nutritive sweetener that are man-made. And again, all food is chemicals. This does not mean that they're harmful. And in randomized placebo-controlled studies in humans using physiological doses of these sweeteners, we don't see an effect at this point on the gut microbiome. It just doesn't seem to do anything. It goes in one end, comes out the other. The microbes don't really interact with it. It's not something that they can metabolize, and it's not something that impedes their ability to function. And so those substances are inert, when it comes to the microbiome and when it comes to gut-derived hormones as well. Because that's another thing people get like worried about, oh, what about like my PYY or whatever. So artificial sweeteners, those are thus far safe for human consumption and safe for the gut microbiome. That being said, if you could get yourself to a place that was a human equivalent to the doses that we give rodents, and you're having more than like 13 cans of soda in a day, or more than 40 packets of sweetener in a day, then you've surpassed the acceptable daily intake limit, and then you could potentially have some issues for your microbiome and for other systems in your body as well. But when we are keeping things realistic, what are people usually eating in a day, then it's not going to be an issue. So we just have to make sure that we're looking at what's physiologically relevant versus what is a super physiological crazy dose in a rodent or in a petri dish or in an artificial, GI tract. So sometimes they'll have something that's like stimulates a GI tract. They'll only have a small number of microbes in it. It doesn't really model the complexity of the human microbiome.
Right.
And I've seen some people with certain sugar alcohol type products. I think it's attractive to them because they've heard that they can subtract the sugar alcohol from the amount of carbs that they're eating. So they tend to look for products like that because they can essentially eat more without having that high carb intake. So it's like, it's already decent macros, and then they go ahead and subtract it even more. So they feel like they're eating this, 30, 40 carb bar or ice cream or whatever it is. And there's like, oh, it's only 8 carbs. And like, no, no.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, you might get, your net 8 carbs, but you might not feel awesome, depending on how much of that you eat. And the other thing that's kind of an interesting caveat, because people ask sometimes, do I count the fiber in the food?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, considering the fact that, some proportion of your microbes are able to convert some proportion, some portion of that fiber to some amount of short chain fatty acids, the fiber grams don't really come out to 0 calories. It's 0 to 2 and maybe 4. So it's kind of like, it depends on your personal set of microbes. And we don't have a way of assessing that and quantifying the actual number of calories that they are harvesting for you yet. That would be super cool, but we just aren't there yet. So when we're doing something like that, it's kind of like, okay, the soluble fiber probably counts a little bit. If it's an insoluble fiber, probably not so much. So if I have a product that has like a lot of cellulose, like, a lot of like low carb wraps will have some like a wheat gluten, and then it'll be cellulose is the other, that's kind of like what's giving it structure. Cellulose is not readily fermentable, so that probably really does come out to like effectively 0 energy. You're going to just extract, you'll expel that in your stool. But that just like depends on how detailed people want to get, but that's kind of like my recommendation. Do it the same way you're going to do it the whole time, just for the consistency of tracking. But realize also that, if you're counting every fiber as 0 and you're kind of puzzled as to like why your weight isn't changing as anticipated, that could be one aspect that you're really underestimating your energy absorption.
Oh, for sure. And especially if you're having like lots and lots of sugar-free products, and, maybe not all of the ones that you're using is cellulose based or whatnot. That's super interesting. And that's a question that I get all the time, is like, what about net carbs? What about subtracting fiber. And pretty much my answer for that is let's just not subtract it, for the sake of, if the goal is fat loss here, it's better to be maybe a little bit under because you accounted for it, rather than having this question of why am I not losing weight, because all of these extra things that I'm not counting are actually being harvested as energy. So that's really great confirmation to know that what we've been telling our clients is probably the right way to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's more of a marketing kind of ploy, if anything, just trying to say, oh, this is actually, 8 carbs instead of 30. And so I have a lot of clients who the same thing. They're like, well, I'm hitting my macros, but why are my calories not adding up?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Not to go off on a tangent, but
yeah.
Okay, I have a question that is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's relevant for any of our listeners who have tried keto or are currently doing the keto diet. So people who run the keto diet, they are very, very attracted to the net carbs and things that are labeled that way and marketed that way. And so if that is the case, we have certain fibers that are converted to short chain fatty acids, and then the insoluble ones they pass through. So if they're converted to fatty acids, I might be, my logic might not be going straight here, but correct me if I'm wrong. Does that mean that sugar alcohols are considered okay, quote unquote, for those doing keto and needing to stay in ketosis?
Yeah. So this wouldn't influence, it wouldn't reduce their ability to be in ketosis.
Right.
So that being said, the ketogenic diet in and of itself has an influence on the microbiome, and the fermentative capacity of the gut could be changed in people who are on a long-term keto diet. So you may actually find that you're producing less of those short chain fatty acids anyway, because ketone bodies actually specifically suppress one of the main butyrate producers in the gut. So theoretically they're fine. And actually, like I said, you might actually be producing fewer of those short chain fatty acids anyway. So there might be a reduced capacity for energy harvesting in a keto diet. I'm just theorizing. That doesn't necessarily mean anything like good or bad for your gut, but generally speaking, if we're having a diet that doesn't have a lot of microdiscussable carbohydrates, it's probably not a great thing long term.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, because a lot of times it's like you have people on the keto diet, they're subtracting out the carbohydrates, and then you have some people who are like, no, like you need to just like stick to just vegetables, otherwise you're doing it wrong. But like I was just super interested to know. So little side tangent there, but I'm sure it was relevant to someone. So moving on to just back to artificial sweeteners, I thought that was very interesting, because personally, I've been taking a look at my own intake of it, not because I've had any issues with it, but because I actually sat down and thought about how many different sources of artificial sweeteners and sugar alcohols I had per day. And I was kind of like, that's a long list. And it's in all of the supplements that I take. It's in, my pre-workouts, my proteins. It's also in my coffee syrup. It's also in my sugar-free pancake syrup that I use. So like, there's all of these things that I've kind of made into, and I'm sure a lot of people listening are similar in this way as well, made staples in my diet, and how I dress up my food and how I add a little bit of flavor to things. And so personally, I've been trying to just like not cut out, but just dial back a little bit to see, do I notice anything? Because, there was no negative effect happening with my normal consumption, but I was like, what if, I feel a little better, or I notice a little change here and there? So I'm doing an experiment with myself essentially. But yeah, I think it's really interesting to kind of see how integrated sweeteners and sugar alcohols are into like our day-to-day, especially like fitness interested people. And what you said about how they bring in the water, if they're the soluble ones. And I think that could kind of explain for some people how when they, they say, oh, I feel, so watery or bloated or puffy all the time, I cut out artificial sweeteners and it solved everything. Like artificial sweeteners are the devil. And, really there's just like a normal response there. Like that is what it's supposed to do. So that was super interesting to learn as well.
Oh yeah, sure. And I think also when people are cutting out artificial sweeteners, they may be, just reducing their energy intake because now they're not eating the foods with the artificial sweeteners, or they're replacing them with something else that is more nutritive. And so they have more energy and so they feel better and they're moving more, so it's kind of an interesting thing to think about too, in terms of how ubiquitous the artificial sweeteners or sugar alcohols could be, within, like you said, like fitness interested people and people who are trying to control their energy intake, that sometimes people are consuming a dietary pattern that makes them feel not well because they're afraid of eating the kind of like the normal version of the food, the higher energy density version of the food.
Yeah.
And maybe feeling like less satisfied. And so they have to eat much more of the kind of alternative version of the food. So it's sort of an interesting thing that, I went through that process years ago also, where I was like, wow, I'm feeling the need to have a lot of flavored waters and whatever else, because I just want to eat something that's enjoyable. And I wasn't at the time. And now I can have like a little bit of maple syrup and I'm like, oh, that's really rich. I don't need very much, versus like the sugar-free maple syrup. And yes, of course, regular maple syrup is higher in carbohydrates. But when you get to the point where it's about having like an enjoyable experience rather than just an experience of like high quantity, I think it's easier maybe to regulate the amount that you're eating.
I typically say this for people who have gone from whatever diet they were doing to something like going full vegan or full vegetarian. And they, same thing. I feel great. Meat is the devil and all this stuff. This is what's making me feel so bad. It's like, well, if you're eating, hamburgers and French fries and, whatever else and all this junk food, and then you switch to eating vegetables, like, yeah, you might actually feel a lot better. And if you had just maybe incorporated vegetables into your diet, like normally, you actually might have found that balance between but it's that correlation versus causation. Is it, because I'm vegan or vegetarian, or is it just because you added in some additional vegetables and it actually isn't really meat that you think was causing you to feel that way?
Yeah, exactly.
I actually had a conversation with a client about that literally yesterday. She was like, I'm considering going vegetarian or vegan because I've just been reading about how much healthier these people are. And I kind of went down the rabbit hole of like, well, if you look at the research that compares like quality controlled, like omnivorous diets that are active people and eat healthy diets and they're not, obese or like have a high processed food intake, then, we actually don't see much of a difference. And I went down that whole rabbit hole, but it's like, yeah, it's exactly that. And a good parallel too.
Yep. That's the same thing we see with the microbiome as well. There's no clear advantage to being vegan or vegetarian compared to a prudent omnivorous diet. So that's why I always encourage, plants at every meal, but it doesn't have to be only plants at every meal.
Right. So with the artificial sweetener discussion, more questions about this because we have so many misconceptions to break down. The stevia versus artificial sweetener is another war that I see all the time going on. And it's, this is natural, so it's better for you. And sugar alcohols and diet sodas are bad. And that's kind of the narrative that I hear from a lot of people. I think when I get into the fitness interested crowd, I hear more of the like over reliance on sugar alcohols and sweeteners. But when I am talking to just kind of the lay person and relatives and family friends, it's the, oh, I only use stevia because stevia is better and it's natural and I don't drink any diet soda. And that's like the conversation that I don't really try to get into anymore, but that's what I hear. So could you shed some light on that specifically?
Yes, the naturalistic fallacy. So if it's natural, it means it must be safe. Just like, the arsenic that we can find in almonds and formaldehyde that we find in pears. I'm not kidding. Like they're really found there. But the dose is what really makes the poison. So stevia doesn't have quite as much human data to either support or refute its potential benefits or harm to the microbiome. We probably don't want to assume that just because it's natural, it's not going to have a potentially negative effect. There are plenty of natural herbs that could have negative effects on human health and like life in general. I mean, being alive. So it's sort of it's one of those logical fallacies. But, stevia compared to table sugar, stevia is going to be less energy dense. I think it also tastes awful. So
I'm with you.
yeah. So I personally don't use stevia because I think it just tastes like bitter garbage. It's kind of like the way cilantro to me ruins a dish. Stevia ruins anything in which, to which it's added. So I don't use it, but if people like it, awesome. But, to think that it is superior to table sugar would be also a fallacy. I think that table sugar gets a bad rep because obviously things like, consumption of sugar sweetened beverages, that's associated with poor health outcomes and risk of, cardiometabolic disease. But again, if you take a person who is really physically active and they drink a soda, a regular plain old soda every once in a while, that food in isolation is not going to have a deleterious effect on their health. I've seen plenty when I was still living in Virginia, I helped with a lot of trail races for people who were doing like mountain biking races and whatnot. These people were incredibly fit, incredibly healthy. And guess what? When you're biking 50 or 100 miles, you're going to drink some Coke. You're going to eat some white bagels and some pretzels and some potato chips. So it's looking at the entire dietary pattern rather than one thing in isolation. But it's a thing that I think it's like popular right now to, instead of using table sugar, using like agave or maple syrup or, brown sugar, which is just white sugar with molasses added to it. And they're all plant-based, it comes from sugar cane, or we also get sugar from beetroot, or coconut sugar, whatever, what have you. The molecularly, it's the same thing. So use what you like to use, but realize that, we are adding a health halo to things that are just really on the same playing field in terms of like the biochemical properties.
Right. So with the stevia, you said that there's not much data, but what does the data out there suggest so far?
One that I've seen in cell culture showed that it was, I want to say, suppressive of bifidobacteria, but I mean, that's a cell culture model, and I'm not going to give more weight to that than I would to any other cell culture model just because I think stevia is garbage. I'd say like, that's a cell culture model, and it doesn't actually mimic what's going on in the GI tract. So we really just kind of have to wait and see until someone does some, well-controlled human studies on consumption of reasonable amounts of stevia. We just have to kind of say like, we don't know yet.
That's interesting because we do have a lot of data on sugar alcohols and artificial sweeteners. And I find that very interesting. And I've kind of posed the argument before for someone who was really into having this discussion with me. And I referred to, other evidence-based practitioners who have gone into more depth than this, but than I have, because I haven't really read it any personally. But what I've heard and read from those sources is that there is a lot of data to show that artificial sweeteners and like sucralose, aspartame, those sorts of things are safe for humans. Like you said, the data doesn't show any negative effects. And with stevia, we don't really have much. So it's like, it's not good or bad, but we can't compare it because we just don't have the studies to show. So for me personally, I find more safety in the thought of using something that has been tested and shown to be safe multiple times over and over again versus something where we really don't have the data. So I found that super interesting. And I was like, well, that makes me feel better because I wasn't going to use stevia anyways.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm kind of like, even if you told me like stevia is super bifidogenic, it's great for the gut, I'd be like, awesome. You keep it. You use it. I've got other stuff.
Yeah.
I'm gonna think of cilantro every time I use stevia now.
So bad.
Yeah, so I think the last thing that we wanted to ask you about is all of these supplements that we have that are quote unquote good for gut health. And you've kind of debunked them a little bit already, but I wanted to kind of touch on them specifically because these are things that we have conversations with our clients about all the time. And that would be greens products, probiotics, prebiotic supplements. And then I have definitely run into, I'm eating more probiotic foods, so the kimchis, the yogurts and stuff. So how useful are these products or are these foods, and how much of what we're seeing with the marketing here is really, just BS?
Yes,
Yeah.
please tell me I don't have to eat sauerkraut.
No, I have to say, I actually do like good sauerkraut.
Oh, I love sauerkraut.
Yeah.
Can't do it. Can't do it.
So I'll list them in order of like things that have effective applications.
All right.
So probiotics are effective for specific applications if you use the right probiotic for the job. So the effects of probiotics are strain specific. So if you take a Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG and you're a little kid and you've got diarrhea, you'll probably feel a lot better. If you're an adult, it probably won't have much of an effect, and you should use an S. boulardii instead. So it gets pretty specific, and we're able to say that with more confidence now than we could have maybe 10 years ago, to say like, okay, there are definitely times when probiotics do seem effective to reduce some symptoms of IBS, to reduce antibiotic-associated diarrhea, to reduce traveler's diarrhea. So probiotics in certain situations, definitely a good addition to overall other lifestyle management and like pharmaceutical interventions as needed. Second in line of probiotics would be two digestive enzymes, beta-galactosidase. So that is marketed as Beano, but it's just a digestive enzyme that can help to break down some of the indigestible fibers in our diet that we see in like beans and cruciferous vegetables. And then lactase, which can help break down the milk sugar lactose. So those seem to be by and large pretty helpful to reduce some digestive discomfort. Now, prebiotic supplements, I would say totally not necessary, but not ineffective. It's just that we don't need to supplement because we can just get them from the foods in which they naturally occur. So prebiotic just means that it's an energy source for a microbe. So if you're eating fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, then you're good to go. So you don't have to supplement, but definitely eat prebiotics. Greens powders are usually a blend of a bunch of different probiotics, different digestive enzymes, many of which have not been shown to be effective in humans, or they are not active at the pHs in which they will experience, in our GI tract. And then sometimes like some herbs and whatnot, like superfood blends. And even if those powders and mixtures might contain things that could potentially be beneficial, they're not beneficial at just any dose. So most of them are not going to be dosed in a physiological relevant way. Even if we do increase, like if we take something that has antioxidants in it, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're actually increasing the antioxidant capacity or our antioxidant system. So trying to do that with like one food or a supplement, probably not super helpful. And although it is possible, we don't necessarily always want to be like suppressing our reactive oxygen species production, because we actually need that to adapt to exercise and to fight off infections and whatnot. So like mega doses of antioxidants, also probably not a great idea. I can't think of really like many other supplements. I think that kind of covers like the major groups that are promoted. I guess I would say that in addition, when we are looking at like antimicrobial supplements, that's the only way I think that is an accurate name for them. That they're often really weak antimicrobials, so they're like essential oils or herbs that may be effective in vitro, so in a cell culture dish, or like in the oral cavity where we do get a little like a biofilm like on our teeth. but would not have the same effect in the microbiome. So like taking something that's a biofilm on your tooth versus the tens of trillions of microbes existing in their planktonic state in the GI tract, two completely different environments. That being said, peppermint oil is one that has been shown with pretty solid evidence to reduce some of the pain and symptoms associated with IBS. So again, that's sort of an acute intervention that could be, adjuvant or synergistic with other forms of treatment and management for that. But yeah, for the most part, like there's not going to be a kitchen sink, sort of like gut health supplement that every person should take, unless you want to think of like fruits and vegetables and whole grains and things like that as like a kitchen sink kind of thing. Yes, plants would be that's my kitchen sink recommendation.
Yeah. What about the probiotic foods? So the kimchis, the yogurts, and the, because I think from what I've heard is, you can supplement a probiotic pill or a drink or something like that, or you could, drink the kombucha or eat the kimchi. But what I believe is that it's just the dose is not quite enough in those foods. But could you clarify that a little bit more for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a really great analysis that came out in 2019 by Whalen's group, and they actually looked at the effects of these fermented foods. What evidence do we have for their potential, their ostensible benefits in humans? And they concluded that the only probiotic food would be fermented dairy. And the other foods that are fermented are not considered probiotic. So the definition of probiotic put forth by the World Health Organization is that it's a live microbe that when ingested confers some benefit to the host. So those foods do contain live microbes, but they either are not the type that would be beneficial to the host, or they are not, as you mentioned, in adequate amounts to confer a benefit to the host, or they just haven't actually been studied at all yet. So like, there's something like, I think like natto, we just don't know because no one has actually tried to figure out like what it's doing. So there are some real gaps in the literature there. And, all fermented foods, well, I shouldn't say that. Yes, many fermented foods are going to contain live microbes, or did at one time, because there are other fermented beverages that don't contain any more live microbes because they have consumed all of the sugars and now they're all dead. And then we reap the benefits. We drink the wine and the beer and things like that. So, alcohol is not a probiotic. But
yeah, I think I think it's interesting. I got a Instagram ad, they reached out to me and they wanted me to promote hard kombucha. I don't know how you say it. And I was like, I feel like this is not like this. I don't know. I feel like it's going to cancel each other out.
That's correct, actually. Yeah. Like when we're looking at alcohol intake, unless you're taking in, like maybe one glass of red wine a week, that's hunky dory, but regular alcohol intake is actually associated with reduced microbial diversity. And, especially if we see sort of the extremes of alcohol intake. So if you're, getting all of your probiotics from hard kombucha, got bad news for you. So fermented dairy is actually associated with reduced cardiometabolic risk factors and improved lipid levels. So if you wanted to go that route, it would be an evidence-based addition. So if you want to have like a kefir or Yakult, I think is the brand that's been studied pretty often. That would be one thing to do. But something like a kimchi or sauerkraut, either the evidence suggests that like maybe they don't do anything, or they're eaten traditionally. Like there's some fermented cabbages that are eaten traditionally with beer, and so they're associated with gastric cancer. Well, probably not the cabbage itself, but there's lots of drinking beer. So there are some confounding factors that we haven't been able to parse out yet, and so they just haven't met the criteria to be considered a probiotic food.
So Christina, you do not have to eat sauerkraut.
Thank you.
I think that really is shining some light on some stuff, because I feel like every other Instagram post that you scroll by nowadays is this green greens product, it healed my gut, or this is good for, bloating, or this is good for my gas. And, while that person might have a subjective experience that, they link those two things together, a lot of times I feel like a big benefit of a greens product is it encourages you to start your day off with a healthy seeming routine, and it gets some water in your system. And, if there are nutrients that you're able to get from it, a superfood blend or something, great. You're getting some extra nutrients in, but like, that's really where my recommendation kind of stops, is like, if you want to have that great routine in the morning, like personally, I drink a greens powder because I like the taste of it. And it's like a really solid routine for me that keeps things on the right track. But beyond that, I'm not banking on it to make sure that I go to the bathroom the same way every morning. I'm not banking on it to, heal my gut or something like that. And so I think that's a really great confirmation for that. And for anyone who is scrolling through Instagram and they see a healthy gut coach, or they see a supplement that's supposed to fix these things, just encouraging you guys to be a little bit more skeptical and really, re-listening to this episode, using this information. A lot of it, you might have to sit down and really listen and think through what Dr. Fundaro has told us today, but it's a lot of really useful stuff that can help you think more critically about what you see in the fitness industry, which is unfortunately a lot of misdirective stuff that just, kind of flies in the face of the evidence that you've talked about.
Absolutely. That's my hope.
Yeah.
So Marissa, you brought up social media, and the big common theme or argument I see right now is bloating. Is bloating normal? Is, because you see a lot of before and afters, or this is what I look like in the morning, this is what I look like at night, and this is normal, or this is normal if you look like this after a big meal. And then you have the other side where they're like, bloating is not normal. It's wrong, it's bad, and you need to find the source, or you need to take this supplement. So kind of where do your thoughts lie on that? And maybe even, including gas and bloating.
Well, bloating is not always indicative of a disease state. So we could say that one person's bloating could be normal, and another person's bloating could be indicative of a disease state. And so if a person feels like their bloating is not tolerable, if the bloating is reducing their quality of life and it's uncomfortable and frequent, that, it's a good idea to just go to the doctor, figure out what might be going on, and ruling out the potential disease. And then once okay, I don't have a disease, then the bloating is caused by something that I'm eating. My microbes are fermenting it and producing gas. And from there, awesome, I know that I can modify my diet in some way to reduce it. So it's sort of like to say, in an umbrella sort of way, like this applies to everyone, like bloating is normal. Well, bloating isn't just, there's a spectrum of bloating, and there's also sort of like a spectrum of normal. And, there's normal versus like tolerable. And then there's normal versus common. So you could say that bloating is fairly common, but it may not always be normal for a person. It may indicate that something is abnormal. So keeping those things in mind, like we can't really make absolute statements. It's great to say, hey, don't assume that something is wrong just because the internet's trying to sell you on bad gut health. But also, like don't just say like, oh, everything's normal, everything's fine, and like dissuade a person from going to a gastroenterologist. That's my first step when people come to me with questions. I'm like, have you visited your gastroenterologist? Like, do that, just rule everything out. And then you actually know like what your next step should be, and you're not just kind of flying blind.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that's a good point, because it's like, okay, if you eat food, like your belly is going to distend, like you have more food volume in your stomach, and then you're like, it's normal. But if you distend and now look 6 months pregnant, well, that might not be normal. And if your distended stomach hurts, or if it's painful, so it's hard, because it's like you said, like, yeah, maybe it's normal, maybe it's common, but how do you decipher between normal and common? And hey, you should probably go see someone for that.
Right. And also, the opposite side of things where you've had people who have never even noticed anything post meal or, at the end of the day. And all of a sudden they have people telling them and yelling at them on social media that your stomach being this size after you eat a meal is not normal. And then they're like, oh, let me go diagnose a problem that I don't have.
Right.
And I definitely see a problem with that side of the spectrum too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, bloating I feel like is a real tough one to kind of, because and then the thing, Dr. Fundaro, that you said too, it's like, well, what might be uncomfortable for someone else may not even bother another person or make them feel uncomfortable or get in the way of life. So it's just kind of hard to navigate that one.
Yep, exactly.
And then let's bring body image into the discussion. What if it's not actually painful bloating, but this person just doesn't like the way that their stomach looks after they eat? They might diagnose that as, oh, well, I must have digestive issues. I have to fix something. But no, like really that this is more so now an issue of psychology. And so just making it more complicated.
Yes.
No, that's true. That's one of the sort of unseen potential flags of disordered eating is the sort of a complaint of like chronic bloating, chronic feelings of fullness, or chronic constipation, because a person may have, chronically low energy intake. And so, yes, they are experiencing constipation, but they have a lot of anxiety around what would be considered, not an abnormal amount of stomach distension. After a meal, the stomach is going to stretch and you'll see, a change in waist circumference. And that could be within, what's a normal amount of change. But to that person, it's really alarming and it's creating a lot of anxiety. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind, that, one person who's having a subjective sensation of bloating or distension may actually, like you said, Marissa, be more of a psychological issue.
Right. I guess I do have kind of one more miscellaneous question, and just kind of confirming my biases here. So when I did my first contest prep in 2016, I promise this will be quick, but I did this in 2016, and it was a pretty like strict protocol in terms of, at the time, the coach that I had didn't allow me to have artificial sweeteners. It was pretty like low to no gluten just based on the foods that I was choosing, like looking in hindsight. And, the prep went really well, didn't have any issues really, but I knew going into my post-show meal, what I wanted was a pizza. And I knew that I had not had dairy in about 6 months. And so I went to the store and I bought like whatever the lactase like little capsules are. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to pop like 3 of these before I eat my entire pizza and just pray that everything is okay. And in the past, so I did that. It seemed to work out just fine for me in that situation. And so you did mention that lactase supplements can be very useful for that. And I know that in general, lactose intolerance is something that's very, very common and can be developed. And I wanted to ask you for your comments and opinions on this and any evidence that there is. So does cutting out dairy create a lactose intolerance in some people? And is it possible to reintroduce lactose and dairy products by using some of those enzymes to kind of reverse that effect?
Yeah, so lactose intolerance can happen for a few different reasons. And actually lactose tolerance is pretty dynamic over the lifespan. So it tends to fluctuate. So we could have reduced lactose tolerance just as we age, because we start to express the gene less. So like we have the ability to make lactase, but we just don't. It can happen because we've had some severe GI illness and there's been some damage to what we call the brush border. So it's like the enzyme layer that covers the intestinal cells. So we just don't have enough of the enzyme there. And then it could potentially occur sort of acutely in terms of not necessarily lactose intolerance, but like lack of preparation for a big bolus of lactose. You haven't eaten it for 6 months, you haven't really been expressing that gene, and then all of a sudden you take in a bunch of lactose there's a good chance that, you could produce that enzyme relatively quickly, but maybe not to a great enough extent to completely digest all of the lactose that you've just eaten. And so, your microbes could still get a hold of some of that, and you have some symptoms there. But there's some evidence that, yeah, people can actually increase their tolerance to lactose over time. So just gradually increasing their lactose intake. There's probably going to still be a threshold to that. And, the addition of the lactase enzyme can really be helpful. That being said, there's also a threshold beyond which the ratio of supplemental enzyme to lactose intake is not going to be high enough to like offset any amount of lactose. If you like drink a gallon of milk, and had like 3 lactose pills, maybe you're not going to have a good time. And then different types of cheeses also have like different lactose content. So it's not like all dairy, has the same amount.
Yeah, that's something I've always noticed is I'm a little lactose sensitive depending on what it is I eat, but cheese has always been on the table for me. Like that's never been an issue because of that. And it's like the milks and the ice creams where I'm like, if I don't do one of those little capsules, like I'm not eating that. Yes, I'm not gonna have a good time.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. So I guess to wrap up, we covered a lot. I mean, we covered what the gut even is, what gut health is, or, our lack of definition for it, the 3 Ds of gut health, fiber, gut issues, artificial sweeteners, sugar, alcohols, supplements. We covered it all, and we couldn't be more grateful because there are so many misconceptions about all of these things in this industry right now, because it's kind of, the cutting edge of science right now is we don't really know all too much, but a lot of people are kind of stepping outside of that and making claims and assumptions and guiding people the wrong way. So hopefully this message can spread to as many people as possible. But I guess our wrap up question for you is, with the, arbitrary definition that we have, what is your recommendation for achieving quote unquote good gut health, which we know is subjective and individual?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's not super sexy or like, I don't know, like big breakthroughs in gut health science, but it's the basics that are supportive of human health in general that tend to also be associated with increased microbial diversity. That would be physical activity. So we don't really have a lot of data on resistance training yet, but it looks like people who engage in cardiovascular or aerobic activity and have higher cardiovascular fitness tend to also have diverse microbiomes and higher abundance of those beneficial butyrate producers. So just even meeting the World Health Organization recommendations for physical activity, you don't have to like run a marathon, but if you get, 30 minutes most days of the week of some moderate intensity aerobic activity, probably have your bases covered there. And then also a wide variety of plant foods in your diet. So eating fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, and plant-based proteins, along with your animal-based proteins. If you want to have that, that's another really great way to support a diverse array of microbes and diverse array of genes for them to express as well. And then the kind of supplementary things would be, although they're not supplementary, they're still foundational, but we just don't have as much of like kind of like the direct, influence type of data on these, but things like sleep, because that's going to make it easier for you to engage in your activities and make prudent choices with your food. Stress management probably also will help with those things as well. And then just the, judicious use of probiotics in specific situations. And maybe you want to add in some fermented dairy as well as one of your protein options. That's probably also a good idea. And aside from that, there's really not much else that you need to do or that will really have an appreciable effect on your gut health.
We love it. We love the unsexy answers.
Yes.
Yep.
Well, awesome. I mean, I don't think there's really anything else that we have to cover. And if we figure something else out, we'll have you on for the 3rd time.
Our first 3-peat guest.
Yeah.
That would be a pleasure, always.
Awesome, guys. Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. You can find both of us on Instagram. Dr. Fundaro, if they want to find you on social, where can they find you?
Vitamin PhD or vitaminphdnutrition.com.
Awesome. So you can find me at Christy Lynn Fit, and Marissa is at Marissa Roy Fitness. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we hope to see you back next week.